Welcome to this Employee Benefits Insights how-to session, Human Communication, Connecting with Employees During Difficult Times. The speaker of this session will be on hand in the live chat room on the right of your screen to answer any questions you may have. The Q&A will then continue for up to 10 minutes after the session has finished. Don't forget to follow us and get involved on social media by using the hashtag EBInsights21. Please welcome Astrid Sundberg, Chief HR Officer at Shortcut AS.
Hello everyone, my name is Astrid Sundberg. I'm 47 years old and I'm a Scandi Brit who has lived in Oslo, Norway for the last 9 years. I'm currently Chief HR Officer at Shortcut, who are the largest digital mobile app company in the Nordics. We have offices in Oslo, Bergen, Copenhagen and Bucharest with 120 employees. And as to what we do, well, we're a fast-growing tech company who make apps for a big range of companies such as Ruter, DNB Bank, Securitas, Toyota and Telenor. Now, we are a medium-sized company and therefore I hope that my experience might resonate with any delegates here today who are working in startup or scale-up companies, maybe fairly new to an HR role, where you might not necessarily have a big HR budget, but wish to get started. And here's a little bit about me. I have a 25-year track record in HR and leadership roles, predominantly working for hypergrowth companies. I like to think that makes me a pioneer of the employee experience with a particular passion for diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging. Today, I'm here to talk to you about human communication and connecting with employees during difficult times. In my presentation, I will touch on some tips that I hope will help on how to manage in a crisis, because it doesn't look like we're coming out of this pandemic situation anytime super soon. And our ability to lead and steer during the continuous challenges is probably even more paramount than ever before. Okay, so this time just over a year ago, I'd returned from a trip to Copenhagen, which is the last time I travelled anywhere since the outbreak of the pandemic. It was also the first time I can recall the term coronavirus being discussed. Now, this was February half-term 2020, and due to an unusually warm winter here in Norway, we'd had little snow in Oslo. So, of course, dozens of our keen skiers went away for their ski fix to various European ski resorts. 1 week later, and Norway was put in a complete lockdown as we discovered that the virus had made its way here. The first nationally televised press conference was held by the government here in Norway on the 10th of March 2020, and these conferences continued daily until the 8th of April. I have to say that I really enjoyed the calm and rational communication of our Norwegian Prime Minister, Erna Solberg, whose handling of the situation has been extremely compassionate and thought-provoking, particularly compared to the car crash communication of some other countries. So I'd like to start today with an explanation on what good communication is, why it continues to be so important during a pandemic or any other type of crisis for that matter. So first of all, starting off with written communications. None of us had a manual to understand how to deal with a global pandemic. So the most important part of communication during a crisis really relates to the written information. And to get that right, you have to start with understanding the factual information. This means quite literally reading all the correct and relevant literature. There was a huge responsibility on HR leaders during the early days of the pandemic to know what was going on. I was glued to BBC News and watched every conference that took place in Norway during those early weeks, just ensuring that all my written internal communications were also taken from the Public Health Institute website to ensure that the correct information was being relayed. It was quite exhausting keeping on top of all the reading and the changing advice. So the memos and the policies and the company communications that I was writing back then were extremely labour intensive. And I'm sure many of you will be nodding to yourselves on that one. So oftentimes new rules under the pandemic were being brought in from one day to the next. So there was a lot of work to do in the evenings, and not only that, but understanding the rules that were so often changing and contradicting themselves was a minefield. But when it comes to any form of communication in our roles as HR, our understanding is always the first place to start. It doesn't mean that we have to be an expert. It doesn't mean we have to have all the answers. It just means reading, absorbing, and interpreting the information. At one stage, I even found myself attending the World Health Organization live broadcasts on Facebook just to try and cram in as much knowledge as I could. But it's equally important to take a pause and remember, we're HR professionals, not scientists and not medical experts. So fact checking. When it comes to fact checking, the importance of checking your written information is really crucial. I quite like to write creatively, but when the situation is relevant, and that situation is not relevant during a pandemic. One thing I'll say is that the risk for getting information wrong was quite terrifying during the early onset of the pandemic. And it is absolutely critical that any information you share is from a reputable source. Where possible, I always sent links to the relevant national health or government websites for our employees. This was not a situation where we wanted to summarise or make a careless précis of our own. And sometimes we did make mistakes. I clearly remember communicating a policy around the rules for quarantine before I knew the rules like the back of my hand as we do now, where I made a mistake. So always get someone to look through your communications beforehand if you can. Ask someone else on the team, or quite often I would bounce the written information off a male and female colleague just to ensure that what I had written made sense to them. It can help with those small nuances of wording, correcting unnecessary repetition or lack of clarity. Okay, next I'm going to go on to messenger tools, because after fact checking, it's time to press send. And at this stage, if you are relaying information to your employees by whatever chosen medium that might be. Now, in our case, we use a messenger tool called Slack, which I love. So for anyone who isn't familiar with it, Slack is a channel-based messaging program, a bit like Microsoft Teams or Facebook Workplace. And I appreciate that in many cases, group email is still the right way to communicate. But the benefit I find with a tool like Slack rather than email is that you can go in and amend the message after you've posted it. So any changes or updates, or if you suddenly realize there was a typo, you can change it. And the beauty of using a messaging program like Slack is also that you can see what queries and reactions people come up with. In fact, everyone can see them. So it has this community feel to it, and what many refer to as a playful edge. This means that people can bring humour in where relevant. As we all know, humour connects people. HR memos aren't necessarily an outlet for humour, but nonetheless, I really enjoyed being able to send communications out by Slack, because on Slack, employees can post their questions in the comments, which may help soothe others who are uncertain about the meaning of a written communication. This invites participation from other employees and encourages a feeling of transparency, both of which are good for company communications. And if you're wondering what the 4 pictures relate to on this slide, well, these are custom-made emojis. A lot of our employees just respond with an emoji. I work with a lot of millennials and Generation Zs, and as we're a team of developers, designers, and software engineers, we have around 200 custom-made emojis in Slack. So here you can see 4 of the most popular corona-specific emojis that employees use during pandemic communications. The COVID symbol, quarantine party parrot, the Norwegian Prime Minister, and some employees were even nice enough to make an I love HR emoji. Okay, next I'm going to talk about communication strategies at Shortcut and how we handled them. I worked with 5 other directors on the leadership team, so we're quite a small team, and we had daily meetings to discuss what communications were necessary when, but these meetings alone weren't enough for us to perfect our communications. Some of the best advice I saw around crisis communications came from a McKinsey & Co. article released on the 17th of April 2020. It was and still is a really useful information pack on relaying communications, and it is still relevant now because it's packed full of quite useful tips and pointers. The article was entitled A Leader's Guide, Communicating with Teams, Stakeholders and Communities During COVID-19. So on the next slide, I'm going to discuss some Superius crisis communicator tips that were shared in this report. When it comes to ultimate communications in a crisis, McKinsey & Co said that the first thing to do is to give people what they need when they need it. This centres around focusing on sharing information on how to help employees feel calm and safe. One of the first things many of us had to communicate was the fact that offices had closed down and everyone was working from home. And when it comes to stating the obvious, even basic communication can give a sense of stability. This kind of communication is important because it needs to make people feel psychologically safe. And one of the really important parts of crisis communication is inviting people to ask questions or queries. Even if it appears to be a really silly question, you have to allow people to be a bit vulnerable. At Shortcut, we even created a channel dedicated to news and information on the coronavirus. The rule, of course, was credible news sources only. Communicate clearly, simply, frequently. I think this is such a relevant piece of advice because people's capacity to absorb all the info in one go might be a bit limited in the early stages of a crisis. We use English as our internal language, but we are a Norwegian company and we employ many employees for whom English is not their native tongue. And this can absolutely lead to misunderstanding and misinterpretation. One of the things I did was to give verbal communication updates at our weekly company all-hands meeting, which we are still doing digitally to this day. A written communication ready to back that up can then be a really good idea. As a side note, I'm the only woman on my team, and I felt the push and pull of different needs when it came to communications. I tended to want to communicate more than some of my colleagues. I think that I learned that during a pandemic, a repetition of information is important, and more is better than less. After all, you don't always know if someone has read it or not, and this information is so critical that there's really no harm in making it more frequent. Choose candor over charisma. When it comes to this is to say that there's really no place for rose-tinted optimism in the tone of written communications. That's not to say that you need to write with doom and gloom pessimism either, but just be direct and just be honest. A true story relates to an HR friend of mine who experienced really frustrating difficulties with her MD, who was, at least at the start, playing down the pandemic and acting like it was all a fuss about nothing. And she got quite frustrated by this because he would almost undo the clarity of her written communications by playing it down and spinning what she said was a false sense of optimism. So candor is important, and for written communications to be clear, we should choose being direct and factual over lacing our messages with too many niceties. Revitalize resilience. As we saw the pandemic start to rip things apart, the drain on essential workers, the growing economic crisis, the cost to mental health, there was a need to tap into this sense of resilience. Revitalizing resilience relates to the sharing of positive news stories within the team or organization and how these can act as a beacon of hope when used in the right context. As an example here, communicate and storytell around employees who have perhaps offered to help out in the community. You know, the people who made masks in their spare time or went back into nursing when shortages reached an all-time high. Farming positivity in the right way can counteract the stress in the situation and cultivate positive community initiatives. Distill meaning from chaos. Separating meaning from chaos relates to how we as leaders must weave a meaningful narrative into our organization in the messages and communications that we write and share. Communications that underpin the company values and cultures can be a helpful way of giving employees a shared sense of purpose. For example, we were involved in the release of the Norwegian public health contact tracing app. Working on a product that was connected to the pandemic enabled us to rally together and feel a real sense of meaning that's even helped us embark on a fresh path with a new desire to make more apps for the health and wellbeing industry sector. Okay, people analytics and continuous listening. I'm going to move on to how adapting leadership communication to motivate employees who are working from home is also a really important part of communication. Now, I wouldn't have managed to get through the perils of the pandemic without heavy reliance on our people analytics software. It's enabled us to make important and informed decisions around communication, because by using our people analytics data, we've been able to tap into what our people think. Now, there are many different ones available. We use something called Office Vibe, which is great because it works on a weekly pulse survey rotation for all employees, and it feeds into a dashboard score, which shows an overall engagement as a real-time statistic. Where this relates to communication is that it helps us to listen to what employees have to say, and therefore we hear feedback straight from the horse's mouth, as it were. This was and still is important to our communication strategy because it enables us to survey how we are doing with our comms. We can even analyse it on a company whole to see how well we're doing at presenting a clear picture of our vision and mission, or how team communication is going. And we can see the results of this data broken down into different groups such as team, age, gender and title. As an add-on to the weekly pulse surveys, we also undertook some tailored surveys specifically to collect intel on what people thought about the quality of our communications. So here's an example of some of the communications that we also sent out to our employees during the pandemic. We employ a lot of software engineers, and they are used to working from home alone. So for some of them, the ability to work from home was not a steep learning curve. And as a country, Norway has been offering home office arrangements to employees for many years. But here's an example of how simple some of the communications were that we used on Slack, with a monthly reach out that we sent to every employee. So our surveys told us that people wanted more and regular check-ins, but that not everyone felt it was necessary with a weekly call or a digital meeting. So sending out these Slacks where people could ping, respond with an emoji, enabled people to decide on the frequency themselves. And this meant that we didn't overplay or underplay the importance of individual needs and differences. In the example on this slide, people could actually choose which emoji related to them the most, and we could then act accordingly. Next, I'm going to talk a bit about well-being oriented communications. We also learned from the Pulse surveys that wellness levels, unsurprisingly, took a big nosedive in April to May. This was a tough period for people, especially with the schools and nurseries being closed. As a result of this, we launched an employee wellbeing program for our people, complete with a flexible monthly wellness allowance. We've been toying with the idea for some time, even before the pandemic hit, but seeing the high levels of stress from the survey results enabled us to roll out the idea with more meaning and more commitment. Our wellbeing program for employees gave wellness vocabulary a valid place in the everyday dialogue at our company, making employee wellbeing feature as a core value. The program itself had a deep and introspective focus on individual and collective wellbeing. It was conceptual and holistic, underpinned by a focus on physical and mental health. On this slide, there's an overview of how we designed ours. It started off with the main events, which was a monthly flexible wellness allowance. Now, this was not additional spend, but a cleverly reanimated cost that already existed in our budget. Before the pandemic, we gave employees a free travel card allowance, but when the pandemic stopped us from traveling, it meant that employees were no longer claiming for this expense. So we used the monthly travel allowance cost as a monthly flexible wellness allowance instead. People analytics enabled us to adjust and pivot our communications to employees. By sharing the results of what employees thought, we were able to be completely transparent and say, hey, here's what you think. Here's what's not going well. Stress isn't going too well. We're going to change that and have a full focus on well-being. The last type of company communications we added in were wellbeing chats, and these happen with employees on a voluntary basis. In HR, I think it's fair to say that we are often the keepers of secrets and confidential information, because people will often share private things with us about health, personal life, or relationships. It's a people-centric role that we do, and despite some of the bad rep that HR has received, I think we can all agree that most of us choose this profession because we are people-focused leaders. I've read so many articles about how people and talent leaders have almost crossed the boundaries into being wellness warriors, checking in on people, asking what they need, even sharing our own vulnerabilities to get a conversation going. I know many HR leaders have enrolled on mental health first aid courses in order to better their communications around wellbeing. This is not a fad or a trend, and I predict that this type of verbal communication will gather more and more momentum. I started doing wellbeing check-ins during the pandemic, something that we actually called What's Up meetings, just after we launched the company wellness program. They're not one-to-ones or follow-ups related to work. They're exactly as they are labelled, a chance to check in with a co-worker and to find out how they're doing on a personal level. I've even listed some of the types of questions that you can ask an employee, because that can sometimes be a little bit difficult. What I'll say about the type of questions that you can ask in a conversation like this is that they do need to be handled sensitively, and they should almost always be open questions. If you're talking to someone who might find it difficult to open up, then I think a good bit of advice is to use the ask to ask concept. This means that if the conversation appears to be uncomfortable for them, you can ask them if it's okay to ask them how things are going at home. Don't underestimate the power of compassion in communication with your employees. It's finally being given credit for the value it offers organisations. And this is something that many thought leaders have already been talking about for years. And if, like me, you've ever had to endure your profession being called fluffy, there is a genuine relief in the fact that compassionate leadership is now really being recognised for the value that it adds to an organisation. I'm going to finish up today by this quote that was featured in a really interesting KPMG report on the future of HR. As an HR leader, I've certainly felt the significance and overwhelming challenge of my role during the pandemic. I think any of you who are listening today have probably felt just the same while you've been doing the job of communicator and messenger, supporter, listener, freestyler. So I'd just like to end by asking for a pause and reflection on the inordinate challenges of the past year. It's my belief that some of us, or many of us working in HR, have had to carry enormous burdens upon our shoulders. And we need to remember that while we advise people on the dangers of burnout, we're just as prone to burning out ourselves. For the past year, we've carried not just the responsibility for getting an important message out there in an accurate way, but we've had to deal with compassion fatigue as we support our employees and our families and our friends too. Some of us, myself included, have even lost family members to the coronavirus. So if no one has said it to you for a while, I'm going to end this session today by telling you, well done for keeping your employees safe and informed during this awful time of immeasurable challenge and crisis-driven change. People and talent leaders have shown that we can be effective strategic leaders during a time of crisis, and we maintain the important position of moving from the role of firefighter to the role of formulator as we formulate the new reality of our future. And here's what the MD, executive MD of Repsol, featured in KPMG's October report, The Future of HR, had to say. In our crisis management drills, we had focused on big geopolitical crises, terrorist attacks, and great business disruptions, but we had never really considered a crisis in which The main asset affected by the crisis are the employees themselves. COVID-19 has put HR at the heart of how we understand crisis management and the kind of disruptions we have to be ready for.
Ladies and gentlemen, that concludes this session. Please be sure to ask any remaining questions you may have in the live chat. Our next session, Reward Post-COVID, will take place at 3:30 p.m.